I'm often asked, how much sport can my child do this week? Well, it depends on how much recent training they've done. And what the parent then might respond with is, but they've been picked for the first team and they've got a county trial, they have to play. And my response to that would be, the training completed prepares them for today. And maybe it's better that they miss a couple of sessions and not the whole season. Well, there's many myths out there. And one of them was that a child should do no more sport each week than their chronological age. And so that would suggest that a 12-year-old child could do maybe 12 hours of structured sport a week. And maybe a 10-year-old could do 10 hours of structured sport a week without getting injured. But that's definitely not true. Because if that 12-year-old decides to go out and do 12 hours of hockey training, having not played since last season, then they're going to get injured. And so importantly, it's all about considering how fit they are at that point and how much training they've done. But one of the things we do know is that the amount of sport a child can do each week varies because children mature at different rates. You look at this little football team, and we don't know how tall some of these kids are going to be. But number 11 might be going to be 6'6", and number 4 might have already done his big growth spurt. But importantly, in children before puberty, there's such extremes in how quickly they mature, some late, some early, and this affects their capacity. Imagine how much harder that little boy with number 11 is going to have to work to keep up with the much taller and stronger number 4. So we really need to consider factors such as this when we see why some kids in a team get injured and yet others don't. So what we need to ask ourselves is, how much training have they done to this point to prepare themselves for what they want to do? So we look at the data for the last 4 weeks. We take an average of that last 4 weeks, and then we assess how well did they cope with it. Because there's not one recipe for every child. What one can do, another might not be able to cope with. And equally, week on week, children have different capacities based on how well their battery is charged. And so, whilst we often say that we can take the average of the last 4 weeks and add 10% to it, that figure may vary. Certainly, we know that quite a lot of children would get injured with as much as a 15% increase in the load compared to the average of the last 4 weeks. But other children who've been used to training in that sport for some time, they've perhaps already done their growth spurt and they may be stronger with better energy intake, might tolerate really big spikes in activity without injury. So this is just part of the equation. Just to show you how this works, if you keep a spreadsheet or a diary, where in, say, for example, week 1, the child may have done 12 kilometres of either swimming or running or cycling. Week 2, they did 10k. Week 3, they did 12. And in week 4, they did 10. So we add those all together, and that makes 44. By dividing it by the number of training weeks, which is 4, we get an average of 11 kilometres. And what we know is that around 10% increases are usually safe. And so this week, the child trained to do 12 kilometres worth of activity. And then we do a sort of rolling average. So the old week 1 becomes week 2, and we can start to assess these different loads that have been achieved and how that's prepared them for the current week. But what's also got to be factored in is not all sessions are equal. If we think about, just for example, that maybe you've done a 5k run or a gym session yourself recently, and then you go and do another session which is identical, same gym session or same run, same course, same hills, same everything. But one week it feels really hard, and you might say it feels like an 8 out of 10. And another week it only feels like a 6 out of 10. Same volume, same intensity, same activity, and yet it just feels so much harder. And so it's important that we don't just think about how much they do, but equally we might need to think about how hard they do it and what's their current capacity, because that will impact just how they cope with the session. And then we'll have children who perhaps hear all these sorts of mantras. Try your best, says mum. Go hard or go home, says the coach. And the kid comes back with, but I want to get picked. I want to improve. And so all of these different messages might make the child feel like they should be working at a 10 out of 10 effort. So if we take this scale of effort, which we call a rate of perceived exertion or effort, and we think about it out of 10, when we're doing sort of a 3 or a 4, we're really hardly breaking a sweat, but you can still chat away to your mates and still carry on moving. But once we get to a 7, we're sweating buckets, we're panting, we're beginning to think that we can't keep this up for long. And certainly if we get to a 10, where we feel like we've got jelly legs and you're going to throw up, well, you can't do that every day that you train. But the child who's hearing, try your best, what does that mean to them? Do they always go at 10 out of 10? If they're desperate to get picked, do they go at 10 out of 10? And the kids get injured often say to me, but where's 11? And so we need to understand what their mindset is, what their psychology is, what's driving them to work at these really high intensities. And I'll often share with them, whoever their favourite sports hero is, that perhaps if they went at 10 out of 10 in a match, the next day they might not train, or they might only train at a 3 out of 10. And how pro athletes vary this intensity, this effort, day on day. And certainly, if their capacity is down, this is one way that we can manipulate their load by, perhaps if they're not feeling very well, we can encourage them to not work at such a high intensity so they can still go to training, but they can't train hard. And so we can calculate this by saying, well, how much did they do? And multiply it by how hard the session was. So if we just compare a hard sprint session at 60 minutes with a rate of perceived exertion or an effort score of 8, then it gives us an arbitrary number of 480. But if we have an easy session which lasted twice as much time and they hardly broke a sweat, it still has the same amount of load score. And so if we then start to think about this, is that perhaps if the session score was much higher, do they need more fuel intake for that session? And do they need more recovery? So we do really need to think about not just how much they do, but how hard they're doing it. And I want you to just think for a second about whether you alter how much fuel you give them dependent on the amount of sport that they do. So if I drove your car in first gear, your fuel consumption would increase dramatically compared to, say, fifth gear. So when we're cruising at maybe a 5 out of 10 effort, it's not particularly hard on our energy consumption. But when we're going hard at a 10 out of 10 effort in first gear, that fuel won't last very long, and we absolutely need to adjust what we give kids for the more high intensity sessions. If we want to keep children injury free, we need to plan to keep them that way. So let's just think about all the different factors that we need to consider when deciding how much a child can do each week. We want to ask them how many sports they want to play. Perhaps we're preparing for a new term, and we could ask them how many sports they want to play, how much, how often, how many teams they want to represent, what level they'd like to play at, and whether there are going to be any clashes between the different sports and the different teams that might mean they end up with more than one activity in a day. So we need to consider where their current level of fitness is. What do they need to be able to do for the different sports that they've chosen for this term or season? How much power are they going to need? Strength, agility? What skill set do they need? Is it more of an endurance base where they've got to keep going for long periods? So importantly, we need to consider the demands of the sport when we consider whether they've done the right type of training for the sport that they want to play. And so if they find themselves starting the new term without having done the training, it's better to start slow than not start at all. So maybe in week 1, just consider starting with just school PE and games lessons. Maybe they don't do any extra clubs. And maybe we can encourage them to try and avoid back-to-back activity days. We know that when you do high intensity activities on back-to-back days, the amount of stress on the bone and the muscles and the tendons is much greater. So having a day between initially can really be helpful. And so gradually we can start to add one lunchtime or after school activity. And then during the second week, we might start to throw in some club activities as well, gradually increasing the intensity of the sport that they play. So they could use their effort score so that you both communicate about how hard they're going to go in those first 2 weeks. And if they take their time over those first few weeks, those injuries that we see most commonly in that third week of the term are much less likely to occur. And for the more elite players, we also need to consider planning the whole year. Children can't peak to be at their highest performance throughout the whole year. So when are the most important key dates for their sporting career? And when are their exams? Are there other bottlenecks which might cause their capacity to drop or cause an overload on the system? And perhaps this is worth sitting down with their coach to plan out the year and make sure everybody's on the same page for what this child needs to cram in and how they're going to manage their energy. So all I'm going to say to you is, if you wouldn't run a marathon without training, please don't ask your child to. Build up that training gradually, adding increments of around 10% to allow their body to adapt and get stronger, because ultimately this is going to allow them to do more. Kids can do unbelievably high amounts of sport, but it needs to be built up just like a marathon training plan would be done scientifically, adhering to best practice and making sure that we keep these children safe. Kidsbacktosport.com is a website where parents and coaches and practitioners can go to get more information about how to keep kids injury free and how to get them safely back to sport when they're injured.